Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event titled Pandemic Unemployment Fraud in Context. My name is Matt Weidinger. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. This event is backstopped by a new AEI report titled Pandemic Unemployment Fraud in Context, Causes, Costs, and Solutions, which former Senior Department of Labor official Amy Simon and I released last week. We have copies here in the room for those who are attending in person, and folks watching online can find it easily at the AEI website. Our event today will proceed as follows. First, I'll provide a short overview of recent misspending on unemployment benefits, especially what happened during the pandemic. And then I'll discuss some steps to prevent a repeat of the staggering fraud and abuse that was visited on these programs in 2020 and 2021. Next, Amy will introduce and moderate a panel of distinguished experts who will dig in more deeply on program integrity concerns, state administrative issues, and much more. Finally, we'll have some time for questions from our audience here at AEI, as well as from those of you watching online before wrapping up around 2:45 Eastern. It's early, but if anybody watching has a question you would like to submit, you can do so by emailing Abigail Wallen at Abigail, ABIGAL.WALLEN @AEI.org, or on Twitter, now X, at #UIFraudContext. There's little doubt that the coronavirus pandemic tested the nation's unemployment benefits system more than any prior recession. Lockdowns and mass layoffs starting in March 2020, coupled with unprecedented new federal unemployment benefit programs created by Congress, combined to produce unprecedented demand for unemployment benefits. Claims for state and federal benefits quickly soared to 33 million by June of 2020. That's the equivalent of about 1 in 5 workers in the U.S. economy, and more than 2.5 times the prior record for claims set during the Great Recession, about a decade before. As Americans soon learned, that soaring demand for help included unprecedented levels of fraud and abuse. Everyone from small-time crooks to criminal organizations based in Russia and China attacked the unemployment benefit system in what one expert called the Super Bowl of fraud. Thieves stole identities from everybody, including governors and senators, to everyday Americans, and used them to fraudulently claim often tens of thousands of dollars in benefits per person. One guy even rapped about how easy it was to rip off California's unemployment benefit system. The temporary federal programs legislated in response to the pandemic expired about 18 months later in September of 2021, or a little earlier in a few states. But now, over 2 years later, the incredible scale of improper payments and outright fraud is still coming into focus. Current official federal estimates suggest improper payments totaled a low end of $191 billion, but admit that doesn't include elevated losses from the most abused program called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA. Ultimately, some private experts believe as much as $400 billion was lost, or over 40% of the record $900 billion in state and federal benefits taxpayers provided to support unemployed individuals during the pandemic. Only pennies on the dollar have so far been recovered of that amount or are expected to be recovered. So what accounts for those incredible losses? One key factor was unprecedented benefit increases, especially $600 per week supplements added to all unemployment benefit checks early in the pandemic. Those created a far richer target for criminals to seek to abuse than ever before. Out-of-date administrative systems were quickly overwhelmed by the combined challenges of implementing brand new temporary federal benefit programs, managing soaring claims, and repelling constant fraud attacks. States responded differently, but many lowered anti-fraud barriers to clear massive backlogs of claims. And key design flaws in new programs like PUA, which initially failed to verify the identity or prior work of claimants, opened the door to widespread ripoffs. So what lessons have we learned from all that? First, the policies to avoid are quite clear. Unemployment benefits should once again provide partial wage replacement, not more in benefit checks than recipients could earn from working. Key failings of the PUA program, including allowing self-certification of identity, earnings, and ultimately eligibility, shouldn't be revived, especially in a program meant to connect benefits to prior work and earnings. And Congress should do a better job ensuring that worker payroll taxes cover the cost of unemployment benefits rather than simply tapping anonymous and seemingly unlimited federal general revenues all added to the national debt. The positive policy changes needed are equally straightforward. Federal funding for administering benefits should be sufficient to ensure that states have the capacity to handle future spikes in claims, handle basic cybersecurity protections, and provide robust fraud detection and prevention. States operating this state and federal system should also meet elevated expectations. That includes matching claimants against databases of those who simply should not be eligible, such as prisoners, deceased individuals, people claiming benefits in multiple states, and most individuals using foreign IP addresses, among others. Failing to do that simply invites abuse. If there's good news here, it's that Congress is paying attention. The House last year passed legislation that includes some of these reforms, and last week, leaders of the Senate Finance Committee released a bipartisan framework that indicates their support for many of the same improvements, such as better data matching requirements. If Congress agrees on these proposals, it should help reduce the potential for future abuse and better ensure that deserving recipients have timely access to benefits that they deserve. But one thing is very certain. The criminals who attacked the unemployment benefit system during the pandemic will be ready to strike again if the flaws that made those benefits so vulnerable to fraud are not effectively and continuously addressed. So thank you again for everybody's attention and attendance here. And with that, let me turn it over to Amy and our expert panel for a more in-depth review of these important issues. Amy?
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I'm so grateful to have those of you in the room, those of you watching online, and those of you that have followed this issue, especially over the past few years. You know that this is a conversation that has been going on longer than just today. So I'm delighted today to welcome three fantastic panelists who have each has a perspective on this UI fraud issue that I think will highlight and accentuate some parts of the issue that Matt highlighted from our paper. So the full bios are on the website and in the program, but I wanted to give them a chance to introduce themselves with a bit of a contextual intro by saying, where were they during the pandemic a few years ago? What were they doing then? And what are they doing now? So Randy, why don't we start with you, and we'll just go right down the line.
Thanks, Amy. First, let me thank the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this panel on this topic. It's fantastic to be able to speak about something that I've been working on for so long. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I was about 5 years into being the director of the Unemployment Insurance Integrity Center at NASWA. And we were funded through congressional appropriation at the Integrity Center to help states reduce improper payments and fraud in the UI program. And we were, interestingly enough, very intensely working on what we call the State Intensive Service Project, where we were under orders to get the state, the national improper payment rate below 10%. So we were working with states very heavily on things like work search errors and claimants not reporting earnings correctly. And those were the main issues of the day when 2020 began. And that is one thing that you pointed out in your paper I was glad to see is it really got lost in the sort of the melee of the pandemic, but the national improper payment rate did drop below 10% for the first time in many years in late 2019. And we were very proud to be a part of that. But fraud was sort of a fourth or fifth priority in the national UI space at that time.
And tell us about where you are today. So
I'm still working as the director of the Unemployment Insurance Integrity Center. We're about almost 10 years in now, and we've really shifted a lot of what we do, of course, over the last few years to respond to the the emerging needs that have come.
Hi, I'm Anna Hugh. I'm the director of the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations. And our agency covers everything. Unemployment insurance is one of our biggest programs, but we also have workers' compensation, wage and hour, workplace safety, and human rights. So it's a pretty broad portfolio. Prior to the pandemic, I was at the agency for about 3 years. And I'm still there. So again, it's been a roller coaster, and certainly have had very good engagement with Randy and his group at the National Association of State Workforce Agency, and broadly. And again, NASWA does a terrific job of making sure that states are well supported, that we have sometimes a support group, but more often problem solving, and the ability to really, again, share the woes, but also best practices and what we're able to do.
And hi, I'm Linda Miller. And let's see, before the pandemic, I spent about 10 years of my career in government. I was at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. But then I moved into private sector. And so when 2020 began, I was actually a partner at an accounting firm called Grant Thornton, and I was leading the fraud and financial crimes practice there. Then Congress passed the CARES Act, which I think we're going to talk about some today. And it created an entity called the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, or the PRAC, that was established to oversee all of the pandemic spending. And so I actually got a call and asked if I would come and join as the deputy executive director. And so I left the private sector and rejoined the government as the deputy executive director of the PRAC to stand that agency up during the pandemic. And now today I've started my own boutique consultancy that focuses on helping government agencies manage their risks to fraud.
So I'm excited to hear from each of you, but I think we'll start on the state level with you, Anna. So you ran these programs during the pandemic, which I think puts you in a small category of folks who lived this live in some sense on the front lines. And so thinking about it now, what do you see as the operational lessons learned, and especially around that self-certification gap, which we all retrospect would not have put in there for sure, and I think was criticized at the time, and there were lots of efforts to close that gap at the time, but you were on the front lines of running that program as it was written. So I would love to just hear your thoughts on that era.
Certainly. Well, Missouri actually, let me go back a few years before the pandemic. In 2016, we were able to go live with a modernized unemployment IT system, and it was again, one of those efforts and investments that's a partnership between both the employers as well as government and our legislature. So we were able to, again, get the funding from our state legislature to get that done, but also to get some federal funding to do it too. And even in the development stage, we'd already started putting certain integrity and security measures in place ahead of time. And so when we went live, again, we've continued to maintain that and add additional resources to make sure that, again, we're protecting the trust that the employers are putting the funds in. And, I think the biggest thing that we learned on the operational side is just never underestimate your own team. Mm-hmm. I think as much as we rely on technology, it's really important to, again, consider the people that you have. My agency in Missouri State Government has some of the longest tenured staff, and I sign a lot of 40-year service certificates at our agency, but that has really benefited the ability for the agency to weather not only the pandemic, but the prior recession as well. And so there's been a lot of good institutional knowledge there. When we had to bring in additional resources, again, we had good, stable people to help with that as well. There was also something that we did ahead of time, which is really about looking at the process and making improvements. So not necessarily just relying on what's on the books and what's in the system, but how can we continuously improve our service delivery and our integrity measures as well. And so, we implemented a cross-training program. So for some states who have seasonal implications, the winter workload tends to be a bit higher, right? And rather than trying to hire more people just for that temporary bump in volume, we were really able to use cross-training across the entire unemployment program. So, there are certain times of year tax is really busy, certain times of year benefits are really busy, and again, that helped to broaden our resource scope, and then be able to pivot during the pandemic when, USDOL gave us special authorization to use contract staff to supplement the volume. And, for instance, the first week of March, we normally process 29,000 initial claims. 2 weeks after that, we were at 100,000, and 4 weeks after that, we were at 400,000. So overall, it's like a 300,000, not 300,000, 3,000, right? It's 3,000, sorry. I was exaggerating a little bit. But a 3,000 increase, it felt like 300,000 increase in volume. But again, knowing that we had good staff and then the good resources, again, NASWA stepped in to help train. They helped train a lot of contract staff across the board, including in our state. And again, making sure that people knew what their roles were. But, again, we've talked a lot about the investments in technology and making sure that, it's not a one and done scenario, right? And so that's an ongoing conversation you have to have with your appropriators as well as the employers, too, to make sure that they understand that they have a real investment into that system and making sure that the integrity measures are in place, right? And so that is something that, again, we've been able to have those conversations and also, again, put new resources and models in place, such as we realized that the main reason we were getting a lot of phone calls, so we were deflecting like well over 10,000 phone calls a day, if not more, right? And the way to get the phones to stop ringing is by making sure you were clearing the claims and that you were doing the work, right, to adjudicate. And so we were able to put some measures in place using technology again to offer some level of self-service. We had a same-day callback, but that was overwhelmed during that prime frame. And so we were able to implement scheduling so people could schedule when it was convenient for them. But, overall, I think the biggest investments that we made were really talking about, do people know their role? Do they know what their resource? Are we helping them do their job and do their job well? And also, to go back to the basics of, it's an insurance program, right? So there are integrity measures that are already in place that we really wanted to make sure to adhere to. But with the advent of the new federal programs, that was really not necessarily carried through, right? So typically when you're in a regular unemployment claim, there's due process on both sides. An individual files a claim, and then the employers in that look back period, about 18 months, they have an opportunity to say whether or not that person separated from them in a way that allowed them to qualify for that benefit. When you don't charge employers, for their experience rating against the account, they don't necessarily have the same incentive to engage in that process as well. And then I think the plus up. So in the Great Recession, it was $25, right? In this, it was $600 per week. So for instance, in Missouri, your maximum benefit per week was $320. You add that $600 on there, and it's like close to $1,000, right? And for a lot of folks in our state, that wasn't just twice as much what they were making, it was almost 5 times as much. So again, there were a lot of things in there. And for the self-attestation, I think the most challenging part is we were asked to engage with populations that we did not have any history with them, right? And there was no ability for us to validate that they had their own business, that they had earnings from that. And so, better engagement, I think, with our federal partners on accessing like folks who filed Schedule Cs to say they were self-employed, that would have given us a record of earnings in a way. So, again, the unemployment program is an insurance program, and I think that's the basic thing that we have to go back. If there are populations like the gig workers, like the self-employed, who policymakers want to make sure are covered in future economic downturns, that's really something for them to think about. Like if it is meant to be partial, temporary income replacement to encourage them to go back into the workforce, right, back to earnings, we really have to think about how can we validate in a way that's consistent and allows for that to happen. Or do we, like the child tax credit, right? Or do we allow Treasury with the IRS, who has those records already, to be able to make those types of payments directly because they have the records there?
No, that makes complete sense. And I appreciate your perspective, because I think having kind of gone through that entire experience gives you a breadth of perspective that none of the rest of us have. So thank you for that piece. So Linda, turning to you to zoom out a little bit. So we're obviously talking about unemployment insurance, the paper's about unemployment insurance, but you saw sort of the CARES Act writ large, across programs, across government, and obviously before that you were at GAO. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about the ways that lessons from unemployment insurance might apply elsewhere, or sort of the broader anti-fraud conversation in government right now?
Yeah, sure. So when I was at GAO back in 2015, I was on the Forensic Audits and Investigative Services team, and we set about putting out a guide called the Framework for Managing Fraud Risks in Federal Programs. And the reason we did that was because when we would go talk to agencies about fraud, they'd say, oh, no, you should just call the IG. Like, if you want to talk about fraud, that's their thing. We don't worry about fraud. Our job is getting benefits out the door. The IG worries about fraud. And we were like, well, okay, but the IG worries about fraud after it's happened. You have the responsibility for preventing fraud. And it was not seen as one of the missions that really, frankly, almost any of the agencies that we talked to saw. And so we thought this was a real problem. So we put together this guide, and the Comptroller General, Jean Dodaro, has testified multiple times in the last few years about, we told agencies how they could have prepared for this. Back in 2015, we put this guide out. And mostly people ignored it, if I'm honest. I mean, they started doing some minimal things to comply with the requirements in the fraud framework, but they really weren't putting any real effort into it. And I used to say, after I left GAO and went into the consulting world, I used to say that my job was like trying to get people to believe in ghosts. Because I would say, well, you should, have you thought about fraud? And they'd say, oh, we don't have a fraud problem. Fraud's not, problem here. And we would, what I would always say is, if you took all the policemen off the streets, you wouldn't have any more speeding either. Like, you're not looking for it, so you don't have it. You don't think you have it. That's just because you're not trying to find it. And so, but no one would listen, right? Everybody was like, oh, that's cute. We have to worry about all these benefits, right? And then the pandemic happened. And I mean, obviously the pandemic was devastating in every way. There was really no silver lining that one could look for. But I will say that one thing that changed was that people stopped thinking I was talking about ghosts. Suddenly people were like, whoa. And, they had no idea. I mean, I really think that it shocked people across, agency officials, the public, the congressional staffers. I think nobody was prepared for the sophistication of the modern fraud actor. And those guys had been stealing information for decades in all these data breaches. We thought the data breach was just an inconvenience for us. What we didn't realize was that all of that information that was getting stolen was being monetized on deep and dark web forums. And these guys had all that data, and they were just waiting. And so, you see things like the California state prisoner case, where every single prisoner, some really smart fraud actor decided to apply for unemployment benefits on behalf of every single prisoner in California and got them. Because guess what? California wasn't looking at prisoner data, along with 15 other states. They were not cross-referencing prisoner data with people applying for unemployment insurance. And when you tell that story today, you tell that to the random person down the street, they're like, what? How is that possible? But the agencies have not been checking data. They haven't been sharing data. They haven't been validating data. And so I think for me, the lesson learned when I was at the PRAC, and we knew there was going to be a ton of fraud in these programs, and it was really unfortunate because we knew that the agencies at every level, federal, state, local, were not prepared for what they were going to experience. I don't think, frankly, that I thought it was going to be as bad as it was in the unemployment assistance program. I didn't think that, and I know the estimates are all over the place, from 91 million or billion in the IG all the way up to some people speculating 400 billion. That's a lot of money. That would be close to 40 or even more % of all the money that went out. I think that was alarming to many people, including myself, actually. And I think that the lesson to be learned here is that it wasn't a one-time thing, that we weren't ready, we were caught completely unaware. And just because the pandemic is over and this massive influx of money is not happening anymore, those guys have learned some really important lessons of how to defraud these programs. And they're continuing to steal at scale because agencies have still not put in place a lot of the tools and the technology that they need.
Yeah, and I think the point about that last point you made about the fact that it's not past tense, like it was, the pandemic was terrible, but there still is fraud happening, not just in unemployment, but in other programs. And I think it's morphed, it has to be more nuanced in the regular UI program. But I do think that is something that I want to underline, that our paper is about pandemic fraud, but the fraud story is not over. It has not gone away necessarily. So maybe on that note, Randy, you're seeing across states, right? You're seeing patterns and trends in fraud in UI systems, and you have been for years. And so I'd love to hear some of your perspectives about both the past tense, like what do you think in retrospect states could have done to be more prepared, or what things might you have hoped for them on the front end? But then also, when you look at it right now, what are you seeing? What are you taking from what's happening?
Sure. So, I don't think it's possible for someone to appreciate what it was like to be running a state workforce agency at the beginning of the pandemic. Kudos to Anna Hugh. I'm very proud. We are their national association, and what they were able to accomplish given the circumstance that they were thrust into really is impressive. They facilitated the payments of hundreds of billions of dollars to rightful claimants that really helped keep our country and helped us weather, the pandemic. But, I was in a workforce agency when the Great Recession was happening. And I recall vividly, right, the stress on the commissioner from the daily news stories of the people, the photos of the people lined up around the block, right, because they couldn't get their benefits paid timely. You look back on the Great Recession and all the stress that brought, and that was a bright, sunny day, right, compared to what these state administrators and state employees dealt with in 2020 through, honestly, somewhat today. And so it needs to be recognized that while that fraud was horrific and really unprecedented, there's also a very noble side to that story as well. However, before the pandemic hit, right, states were implementing fraud policies and procedures based on their individual state risk. For example, we knew that identity theft was a problem in Florida. And so Florida had put in a FIRE system that, a high-tech data-driven system to help them identify ID theft because that was a problem in Florida, right? States were speaking to prisoner cross matches, right? It's not that states didn't recognize that that was available to do. Is that the metrics didn't bear out that it was a problem, right? Unemployment fraud prior to the pandemic, even during the Great Recession, hovered at 3%, right? Even with the massive claims volume in 2008, 2009, that fraud rate stayed at 3%. Prisoners filing for unemployment insurance was not a significant problem. So there was a data broker out there that sold access to prisoner incarceration cross matches, right? I was very engaged with that vendor for a number of years pre-pandemic because obviously they wanted states to adopt that. And while some states did, the reality was that the cost of implementing that solution and paying for that on their limited budgets didn't play out in a need. And so it's not that it was ignored, it was that as business operators, right, we prioritize what's important and what needs to be worked on, and that wasn't it, right? Again, the metrics just didn't bear it out. It wasn't that they didn't believe fraud was possible or was happening. It just wasn't happening to the extent that it garnered that much attention. But the fraud that happened during the pandemic was not related to what was happening pre-pandemic, right? PUA and the way it was written is actually what facilitated the fraud and created the fraud mechanisms that then took over, right? States weren't having to battle account takeovers. They weren't having to battle bot attacks. They weren't having to battle ID theft, at scale, right? And so it's not that states should have been more prepared. It's that they were prepared for the game they were playing, for the world they were living in. Of course, they could have done better, right? Everybody can always do better, but again, that was what they were doing what they were required to do. If I had to look back, right, hindsight's 2020. If there were things that states could have done pre-pandemic that would have helped them, there's a couple of things. So account takeovers, where criminal actors hack into legitimate unemployment accounts, change the banking information, and steal the legitimate dollars and reroute them to illegitimate bank accounts, right? That has never been a thing in unemployment insurance. So, if you look back and say, well, when states adopted a modernized front end to their UI system, implementing multi-factor authentication, even back in 2020 was sort of at its infancy, right? But had they adopted MFA, that would have thwarted a good portion of that, right? Another thing, when I was working in the state, debit cards was how benefits were paid. And it was really in 2010 to 2015 that direct deposit started to become really taken up and an option that almost every state provided. Well, what no state that I'm aware of thought of was we should be validating bank accounts on these direct deposits, right? Before we release funds to a direct deposit account, we should be verifying that the account owner is actually the person that's filing the claim. There are tools out there that at least allow for that to some extent. That certainly could have been helpful. Just prior to the pandemic, the UI Integrity Center that I'm responsible for at NASWA, we implemented what we call the multi-state cross-match in our Integrity Data Hub. So we started receiving claims data from the states, and then we're able to identify for each state when a data element used on a claim in Missouri is also being used on a claim in, pick another state. And so we had just launched that in late 2019, and there were about 17 states using it when the pandemic hit, as they were all getting up and running with it. And so when the PUA program was announced and states realized they had to stand up a brand new computer system for a brand new program, if they would have had the luxury to be able to implement multi-state cross-matching in the Integrity Data Hub with that, it would have certainly paid dividends. I can certainly appreciate why they couldn't. I recall sitting in my desk one day, and I got an unsolicited phone call from the commissioner of a state saying, "My governor wants to talk to you right now." And the governor gets on the phone and he says, "Randy, what is going on? And what can we do to stop this?" Right? That is what these agency heads were dealing with, right? I'm certain that Annie Hugh received phone calls from her governor in March and April of 2020 saying, "Hey, what is happening?" Yep. Right? And so while there certainly are things that states could have done, I will say that what they were doing was working for the environment that they were in. Looking at today, right? The latter part of your question, right? So we have now every state using the Integrity Data Hub, right? All the states are getting multi-state cross-match and able, to have the benefits of that. We had a really great success story, Kansas, in February of 2021. Kansas was getting inundated with bot attacks like every state was, right? And so Kansas went out and they basically purchased a solution that put a firewall around their UI system so that bots and was keeping the bad actors out. In the first 24 hours that they turned their system back on with that firewall, they blocked over 100,000, somewhere around 100,000 login attempts and claim filing attempts from bots. And over the course of the first month of that firewall being in place, they blocked almost 5 million bot attempts at filing claims and people trying to log in to accounts fraudulently. That's Kansas, right? Little old Kansas in the middle of the country. That's what they experienced, right? Times that by 50 for California, for the larger states, even their neighbors of Missouri. Another success story, states have become incredibly good at utilizing data. So there's a state that we worked with right in the thick of it where they had adopted some data analysis models. And we did a pilot with them where we took their data and absorbed it into the Integrity Data Hub, and we did analytics on that data, and we funded a fraud investigator in that state for 6 months to investigate the claims that the Data Hub sent back to them, these high target, high value claims. And they were able to verify with about 98% accuracy that what we were sending them was in fact fraudulent claims. And so we were able to take that information from that project and tune our Integrity Data Hub so that whenever claims are received that meet those criteria, right, the multitudes of criteria that we identified, when those rules fire, essentially, we can send back high priority hits to the states so that they can work those. And so that's, it took a lot for states to pull themselves away from the political and media craziness, right, to focus on what can we actually do about this.
Yeah. No, I think that that is an incredibly important point, that at the beginning of the pandemic, the problems were not just operational. There was also the ecosystem problems in terms of people relying on the system for benefits, legislative and political pressure, and the transition to remote work, which lots of states we're not, lots of workplaces, not just states. We're not ready to make that transition. But I think to think now, there has been a lot of progress, and there are new tools that are different than where we would have been in, a few years ago. So just a reminder, if you want to submit a question and you're online, you can email abigail.wallen@aei.org or use the hashtag #UIFraudContext. So feel free to do that, and I will get some questions up here. But I have one more that I wanted to send to each of you in a sense. So I think a lot of the pandemic conversation is this looking back, and even now, still trying to understand, put the pieces together, what happened. And there are a lot of holes in our understanding, quite frankly. And I think that our paper was one part of trying to fill those holes. I think I have more questions, in some sense, the longer I work on this issue. But I think let's switch a little bit and look at the future. So at some point, another crisis will come, right? American workers will, in large numbers, again, need to rely on the unemployment insurance system and will be back. And I think we will need it to function well again. So in the middle of the pain of the pandemic, there's lots of desire to make change because we're experiencing the pain live. And I think the states have made incredible progress. There's lots of modernization efforts underway, not just on the fraud front, but across the board. But I think when you think about the policymaker level, so not necessarily the guts of what's happening day to day on the states, but kind of at the incentives level, at the policymaker level, what are the 2 or 3 things that each of you think would be at the top of your list? Maybe this sense of ensuring readiness for the next crisis, but I think also, to some of Linda's earlier points, defending what is happening right now. And so on that front specifically, I look at the Hawaii disaster unemployment assistance just a few months ago, right after the fires, and the system was again quickly inundated by fraud attempts. Now I think Hawaii responded, and that is its whole own saga. But it was a reminder that folks are still right outside the door. So we have a present tense problem. The system's going to be under stress again. So when you're thinking about policymakers, if you had a magic wand, what would you put at the top of their list? So let's start down at the end with Linda, and then we'll come back. So
well, and I kind of want to just make a gentle pushback to some of the things that Randy was saying earlier, because while I'll say that maybe there was a 3% fraud prior to the pandemic rate, that's the amount of fraud that was identified. Going back to my police officer example, right? There aren't that many police officers on the street when it comes to fraud. And so the numbers, they look real small and everyone's happy. And because the number looks small, everybody walks away. Congress and everybody else walks away and says, there's not a fraud problem. There was a lot more fraud than 3%. And they were not prepared for the game that they were playing. They were prepared for the game they thought they were playing. And that's because fraud is deceptive. And how much fraud is literally unknown because they're good at hiding it. And so 3% is way smaller than the amount of fraud that was in the unemployment assistance program prior to the pandemic. I would stake my entire career's earnings on that fact. How much? We don't know. We don't know how much was in pandemic unemployment assistance right now. Literally, the numbers vary by like $300 billion, and that's in one program. So we don't know how much fraud was in the unemployment assistance programs prior to the pandemic, but I would 100% agree that there's still an awful lot now, and especially because there's a whole new generation of fraud actors that cut their teeth on the pandemic. And now they learned how to buy these how-to manuals. What we see on the deep and dark web is that after a disaster like in Hawaii, it takes approximately 8 hours for how-to manuals to start getting sold on the dark web, how to steal money from disaster programs. Literally 8 hours later, you can go on the dark web and buy for $25 a how-to manual, and it will tell you the standard operating procedures of that state agency and how you can overcome them. So bot attacks, credential stuffing, all these things are happening right now, and they will continue to happen. So to the question of the policy issues, it has to be the states. They decided, they made a calculated decision not to say, for example, get prisoner data, as Randy mentioned, because it didn't seem like the cost was worth it. The fact is, they have to do a risk assessment to understand the likelihood that there's going to be how much fraud is going to happen, and they do need resources, right? And there has been a lot of money flowing to states in the last few years after the pandemic. We know that the money has been coming in. A lot of vendors are coming in. But is that money being spent in a way to identify your highest priority fraud risks? And so I would say there needs to be more funding, but the funding has to be targeted. The funding has to be targeted at doing the kinds of things like identifying these risks on deep and dark web forums, really monitoring the threat actors. Many states, I work closely with dark web reconnaissance companies, and very few states are really making use of these tools to really monitor those threat actors, to find those how-to manuals, to find whose information is being stolen, and to understand where those vulnerabilities are. And so I think that the legislative priorities should be on equipping states with the right kind of tools, not just vendors, not just technology, but also in-house expertise on fraud. Many of these state agencies, not just on employment insurance, have very few, if any, credentialed fraud experts that really understand this threat, that understand who and how fraud is manifesting itself today. And so I think there needs to be resources and attention paid. And I mean, I just honestly believe, the GAO put out a fraud risk management framework almost a decade ago. Most agencies didn't do serious fraud risk assessments. They didn't target their resources to the highest risk areas. And had they done so, they would have been able to be better prepared. So going forward, more focus and attention and requirements, honestly, on federal agencies at every level, federal and state agencies, to do these kinds of activities and to demonstrate the outcomes that they've been able to achieve through these activities. Because too often, it's easy for us to say, we put in place this training, we put this tool, now we have this tool. Are we measuring the effectiveness of these tools? Are we measuring the effectiveness of these activities? It's not easy. Measurement is not easy, and it's not fun, and it's not exciting, but it is the kind of thing that's going to be able to demonstrate that we're seeing progress.
And I think just to that note on outcomes, right? That throwing money at the problem, even throwing staff at the problem, that by itself is not going to necessarily get us to outcomes. So we need to understand what are evidence that we've made a difference, that we're actually moving in the right direction. And I think because the threat actors are dynamic, our response has to be dynamic. And I think that, to your point, is not how we have been operating. And that's not just a UI problem, just to be clear. It's a broader problem. So Anna, what about you? What would be on your short list?
Well, our top priority is making sure that we serve citizens, right? As the state agencies that administer these programs, and make sure that they're operating in a way that meets its mission. Unemployment was really created as a reemployment program. It was really investment by the employer community to make sure that, again, it's partial temporary income replacement, because it is trying to encourage people to go back. Now, the pandemic was a scenario where everything was shut down, everybody went home, right? In Missouri, we opened up much earlier, and we basically stopped the pandemic program administration in our state. And so we were able to get a jump start on that. But for other states, they've been longer, and even before the pandemic happened, there was a really tight labor market, right? And as the pandemic and the economic recovery has come on, there's been a very persistent, like for every worker looking for a job, there's at least 2 vacancies. Now, whether they're qualified for either of those 2 vacancies, we don't quite know, right? But the bigger thing is, again, how do we balance that sort of service delivery, making sure that we are getting benefits to those who are eligible to them, right? But also having those integrity measures in place. And I think the really scary thing about the fraud now is that, the historic things that we have had in place, like even having somebody show up in person to validate their identity. Well, between the fake IDs and, we had like an instance where I think one of the states talked about where this one person came into a variety of job centers to do in-person validation. But every time they came, there was somebody different, right? And so it took a very savvy staff person on site to recognize last week this person came in as Roger. This week he came in as Tom. So you can't forget about good old-fashioned fraud too, right? That's all in the backdrop too of a lot of investment and attention to making sure that there's equity in these systems in terms of making sure that people have the ability to access the benefits that they are eligible for across the board, right? Urban, rural, across, if we want to do self-service with broadband, if we want to make sure that, that there's an ability, again, for we've got the USPS program right now to allow for individuals to go to a local post office to validate their identity if they, in fact, fail online identity proofing, right? So there are lots of things that I think we're trying to put in place, but it's that balancing act. How are we serving folks? And at the end of the day, it is making sure that we are protecting a trust that the employers have invested in to make sure that when workers are out of work, that they're given that sort of benefit to kind of get through that. But the pandemic has, again, showed us that there are populations which we historically have not had any engagement with. And so if, in fact, in the future, that is going to need to be addressed, then we need to think more holistically about that. You know, going back to funding, we've talked quite a bit about making sure that the right resources are in place. And I think, you know, there's a lot of terrific one-time funding opportunities that we have. But, you know, as somebody who has to go in front of the legislature every year and defend our budget and what it takes to run the program, you know, one-time money is great to get the solution in place. But then you've got to maintain it. You've got to renew your licenses. You've got to keep training your staff so that they are up to date on the latest fraud, you know, schemes and how to do that prevention, right? And, you know, again, the funding model with the resource justification model for unemployment in particular is something I know our colleagues on the House Ways and Means Committee have been looking at as well as the U.S. Department of Labor. But it is something that for decades the states have really been, you know, talking about, hey, look, we are more and more reliant on making sure that we have the IT backbone infrastructure to deliver services in the way that individuals need it and want it today. But at the same time, one-time money does not make that long-term investment, and it's never going to be a one and done. So, you know, that is that ongoing conversation of, again, how do we resource appropriately so that eligible individuals get those benefits, but at the same time, we are protecting the trust.
Yeah, and I think just to that point on administrative funding, the sense in which the pandemic experience just resurfaced all of the issues that anyone who's followed unemployment insurance policy knows have been the topics of conversation for decades. So the administrative funding model and the the tying funding to claims volumes has made waves basically of funding, and then when there's a emergency or some sort of crisis, then an extra big wave of funding comes, but that doesn't allow the system to have the sustainability to know that you can make investments over the long haul. And I think this pandemic experience absolutely showed that. And I think the one thing that I would like to see from the pandemic investments, infusions of one-time cash is, again, that point about outcomes. Like, let's make sure that we also got value out of these one-time investments and have a conversation about the admin funding underneath.
Yeah, what does it really take to run this long-term so that we can, again, make those investments over time, but also make sure that there are performance measurements that are in place. Like, one of the biggest things we talk about our governors wanting information. Well, he didn't want to know about how many claims we processed. He wanted to know how many people are we helping, right? And with a lot of the new pandemic programs, they moved from one program to another program and back and forth multiple times. And with multiple sets of guidance coming from the department, it was really hard to track. So, you know, I think the measurement area too, just performance measurements overall, that is something, you know, I sit on the Workforce Information Advisory Council for DOL, and we talk about, are we really utilizing our, you know, data-rich environment in ways that really give us the business intelligence to help us run a better program and you know, prevent fraud as well.
And last but not least, would love to hear what's on your list, Randy.
Yeah, I'm glad Anna brought it up. No conversation about you. I would be complete without talking about the woeful underfunding of the program. But, you know, in talking to our members, I would say that, you know, WIOA, another program that all of our members administer as well, they get 3-year money, right? UI gets 1-year money in this odd fifth quarter that they have to scramble and figure out what to do with. And so if you take UI and make it a multi-year appropriation like they do for other federal programs, it allows those that administer these programs to have more of a planning timeline, right? Many of the solutions that state adopted to get them through the pandemic and many of the staff that they hired and trained to get them through those, right? Those are no longer because the funding isn't there to support those now that the pandemic and the pandemic administrative funding has gone away. So multi-year funding for sure. Another thing, listen to the states. Listen to the states that administer these programs, right? They're the ones that know what they need to make this work. And so I would encourage, I know that there's conversations on the Hill happening about the resource justification model. And while there's an argument that I make that it's not really broken, it's just that the pie's not big enough. The fact that we're talking about sort of overhauling the administrative distribution model, that's a welcome conversation. But states were asking for relief from the state merit staffing requirements as the pandemic was, winding down, as they say, and they weren't given that, right? And so states then they set up these robust operations, and they all of a sudden then had to pivot to something different because all those folks they'd trained in this very nuanced, complex world, they could no longer have. And so the states know what they need.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great note. And I do think that last point about staffing flexibility is not well understood outside of the folks that are in these circles, but the impact of losing the staffing flexibility when the program ended by statute, but not when the workload ended, right? So the work continued, even though people couldn't apply for PUA. That didn't mean the PUA workload ended, and states lost the ability, to your point, to have all of the tools and trained staff that they needed to finish, and some are still finishing that process. So I think that's a great point.
So I would be remiss if I didn't speak up about data sharing, right? So you brought up Hawaii and their DUA program, right? There is data that exists right now that the state of Hawaii could have capitalized on to verify income for the folks that were suffering from that disaster, right? Pick a fraud prevention topic, and there is data that exists, a lot of it with the federal government, that would help in these programs. So trying to stand up this integrity data hub for the last 9 years, right? It has been barrier after barrier after barrier trying to get access to federal databases that are there, that are readily available for us to utilize to help states identify fraud, that it is incredibly difficult to get access to. So if you look at things just from a layman's perspective, right? Our data, my data statistically has already been stolen how many times, right? And I certainly appreciate fully the need to protect data. That's not what I'm suggesting, but the lengths at which we have to go to access resources that are readily available really is exhausting.
Right, there's not agility in that data sharing piece of the conversation, which inhibits agility further down in the operational.
I will say the folks over at the Office of Payment Integrity at Treasury, right, they have been so fantastic in trying to help us get access to Treasury's resources, and I think we've finally cleared one of our final hurdles there. So it'll be the first time we've actually been able to successfully access some federal data that will allow us to identify fraudulent activity. So there's progress being made, but at the pace of government.
Yeah. Well, glad to hear that. And I do want to open the floor for questions. I certainly have more, but I wanted to open it to the room first, since you guys are here with us live. If anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I will let you can repeat your question so everyone can hear it too. And if not, I've got a few from online. So, yes, go ahead.
So I've got a, how you doing? So I've got a question about AI. So, what I'm hearing in this is a lot of, the speed with which these programs needed to be developed, and then the speed with which they needed to be implemented. People didn't have 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks to kind of go through all the verification processes and things like that, because the entire country was laid off, kind of like that. Mm-hmm. But yet, I think, Linda, you said that it takes 8 hours. Was it you who were saying it takes 8 hours for a guide on the dark web to show up saying, here's how you're going to exploit this program? So I wonder, is there an opportunity for AI or for various systems to actually do that interrogation as these programs are being developed, saying, okay, AI, tell us how this program is going to be exploited by people on the dark web, and get us that information right now so that we can, begin to mitigate these issues before they occur.
Yes, go for it, Linda.
Well, yes, you can use AI for that. That's a great use case for artificial intelligence. I would say that any way that an agency would go about. I mean, AI will potentially do that faster, but these are not really difficult to understand. I mean, if you did an assessment of your own program, like Missouri knows how these programs are administered. If they've done any kind of, what we do is develop a fraud risk map, and we keep it updated as fraud schemes are emerging. And so if you've done that, if you've created a fraud risk map and you understand how these fraud schemes are perpetrating, then you know exactly what they're going to do. And so you wouldn't necessarily need to ask AI. I mean, it could accelerate something. You could potentially ask ChatGPT to give you all the ways that a fraud actor could defraud that program. But there are sort of that is a limited set of ways that they could do it. And what the problem is, I think, ultimately that agencies haven't done this thinking. They haven't gotten into the mind of the fraudster. And the fraud actors' minds, I mean, they're all following a pretty similar playbook. And so you can pretty much understand that you can break it into different types of schemes, whether those are bot attacks, like, credential stuffing and using information that they've stolen to really attack the whole system and see how quickly they can get in a brute force type attack, or whether they're using social engineering schemes. These schemes are known. And so what's important to be done is for each state to have a deep understanding of the way fraud's manifesting itself today, how these threat actors are behaving, and then to look at your own systems and understand where there are vulnerabilities. And I would definitely echo what Randy was saying. A lot of this can be identified through use of data. So for example, identity theft and synthetic identity, that's the primary way these guys are doing it, right? These how-to manuals are going to tell you which of the processes you should focus on when you're trying to commit the fraud. But they're all using basically some type of stolen identity data. And so if you know that identity theft, synthetic identity is your biggest risk, then understanding what you need to be able to understand is whether or not the person who's applying for this benefit is really who they are, or if they're a threat actor. It's actually not that complicated. What's complicated is what Anna was talking about earlier. Some of it is they don't have the tools. A lot of it is they don't have the data. Some of it is an equity issue. Some of it is the fact that every time they come up with a new system, like let's say we're gonna do document authentication, and we buy a tool that's gonna verify the veracity of your driver's license, and it can check really quickly and identify all the elements on your driver's license that look suspicious or not within seconds. Okay, great tool. I go buy that tool. I implement it. It takes some time. I get my people trained on it. And the fraud actors have figured out a way around that tool almost as soon as it's deployed. Mm-hmm. And so now you've spent this money on this new tool, and the tool is now outdated. And so that's what the challenge right now is, at the speed with which the fraud actors are adapting is very difficult. It's difficult for banks to keep up with. So you can imagine how difficult it would be for federal and state agencies to keep up with. And so we have a really, really sophisticated adversary now, and we can't fight this adversary by buying a tool that's going to take 6 months to implement and then another 3 months to train everybody on. We have to be quicker. We have to use AI. We have to use deep and dark web intelligence. We have to be more agile. We have to change the way we procure and the way we deploy tools. I mean, it has to be an entirely new game.
Any other questions in the room at the moment? I had one from online. So this is sort of about the different levels of modernization that are happening at the same time. So knowing that the proper technology for UI systems, so modernization kind of writ large, often takes months or years, many years in some cases. What are 3 or 4 things that states can do this week or month to address known deficiencies? So I think you were already starting to get there, and I think each of you have touched on it in a different way, but I'd be interested a thing or two from anyone who would like to chime in.
Known deficiencies in their system?
Yeah.
What can they do today? The only thing that's coming to mind is I do believe that states continually do that.
Well, I think building on what Linda was talking about, at the speed at which the fraudsters, they could spend 100% of their time figuring out how to defraud us. We have to figure out how to deliver our services and combat fraud, and think about what that next scheme might be, right? I mean, AI. I had a friend who got a call recently. It was a mother and saying that she needed money right replicated her voice and everything. It was very scary. Luckily, was able to text with that mother and made sure that that wasn't her, right? So we know the technology exists. We know that people who understand how the system works are going to utilize those types of tools, right? But I think the biggest advantage for us as states is the fact that we have good organizations and partnership and frankly that support group, right, of having those conversations. So as soon as we start detecting something, we can be in touch with this broader network and be like, are you seeing this too, right? We just put in X to try to identify this or prevent this, you know, and I think that's kind of the biggest resource that we have is not just the technology itself, but the brain trust of all the states and what they're encountering in their own situations, right? And knowing that we have 53 different programs? Yeah, 53. And the fact that every state's state laws are somewhat different too. And again, you know, we saw this during the pandemic. So Missouri was the lead state for Innovate UI. It was a consortium, and we all have kind of the same, we're cousin systems. We all have the same base code for our system. And we talked and, you know, really built up this relationship ahead of the pandemic hitting, but really used that group as very regular conversation about what are you seeing, not just in the program implementation, but also making sure that we are sharing like the challenges and issues, what other solutions could there be, you know, having good partnerships across the state, but also with our vendors, right? And being very candid with them in saying that you are the technical expert and I need you to step in and help us better understand this. We are the business side expert and we can help smooth those things out, right? And so, yeah, you know, Randy, I think your team does a terrific job of making sure that we're all plugged in and that we have opportunities to utilize the resources that the Integrity Center has. But a lot of that's come about because there's been such robust discussion from the states themselves. And we've surfaced the issues, the schemes, the challenges that we've had and been able to figure it out. So maybe it got into the system, but you're able to stop it from actually making a payout at the end of the day, because you notice like behavioral insights. That's something I think AI is going to be really important for, is to help us understand, like, could a real human being have filed this claim that fast? Or would a real human being have taken this long to produce this type of information? Or is it our communication is just really bad? And like, it's not like, you know, when you go to the DMV, right, they tell you have to bring these types of documents to qualify for Real ID. But, you know, again, how are we doing that both on the program side of it and communicating what it is, the program and your eligibility, but also then, you know, connecting that back to, if we're putting this out in the public, they're going to know how we run our programs, right? And they're going to exploit every step of the way. And they're going to have technology to help them do that. And again, they get to spend 100% of their time and attention and brain cells on that while we are busy making sure that citizens are being served.
There's an initiative that the Department of Labor is just getting underway called the Open UI Initiative. And it's correct that UI technology is difficult and it takes a long time and it's very expensive. And so this initiative, my colleagues can speak to it better than I, but generally speaking, we're trying to expand competition in the UI technology space by making more open source technology and modularizing a UI system. So that states aren't beholden to proprietary systems and that they can interchange things quicker as technology continues to advance. So I know that's more of a longer term solution, but it's really great to see that getting underway and there's some good minds behind that.
I would just jump in really quick and just add that they're studying you, but you're not studying them. So understand how fraud is happening. Go and, you know, what you can do next week is convene a group of people to sit around and do a brainstorming session for an hour and a half and say, what are the ways that we could be defrauded right now that we haven't looked at? Understand where your vulnerabilities are. You've got technology and tools that you're using, but guaranteed there's low-hanging fruit that could be deployed. Sometimes that's just training. Sometimes that's just educating people to be more skeptical. Sometimes it's helping them understand that deepfake technology is as advanced today as it is. I mean, everywhere I go and I talk about this stuff, people look shocked. And, you know, it worries me how shocked people are, because I'm like, if they don't understand how sophisticated they are, they don't understand how they're working, they don't understand the schemes, they're not going to be able to build in any kind of preventative tools to stop them. So educate yourself on the fraud actors and what they're doing and how they're committing their crimes today. That's one thing you can do next week, this month, that would be hugely beneficial.
Interesting Linda says that. Thank you. We just convened a group last week of 7 states, but since the employer guardrails have been put back up in UI, that's what criminals are currently trying to defeat.
Right.
And so we had 7 states sitting around a table for a day and a half talking about where they're vulnerable on the employer fictitious side, and those kind of things produce very interesting information.
I think what all of you said also highlights another piece of this, which I am going down the rabbit hole for a different project on this, but the reporting that states do about fraud or about their entire UI operations, tax and benefit side, does not highlight some of these preventative things. States don't get credit for doing prevention. States don't have a way to quantify their return on investment for when they do put a tool in place, what it does stop, the time that it saves staff, all of those things. And I do think there needs to be some rethinking post-pandemic about what the right reporting structure is. And maybe there's some reporting metrics that we actually need to toss. I'm not trying to just add things, but I do think our fraud reporting is sort of one-dimensional, and somewhat because it was not seen as historically a driver of improper payments in the program. But I almost see fraud now as like a separate conversation from improper payments. I think, yes, improper payments needs to continue to be a conversation. We have work searchers, we have base year earnings, all of those separation issues. But I think this fraud lane almost has its own set of metrics, and I think some conversation in the system about what should go in those metrics, what should we be measuring, how do we incentivize states. I think some of that's funding, resource conversation, but some of it is publicity and transparency around the things states are doing right. And right now, if you go look at the PUA data, there are a whole bunch of states that said basically, nope, we didn't have a problem. And I know it's not because they didn't have a problem, it's because they had a reporting issue and they put zeros in. And I just think that's unacceptable, and it doesn't come with consequences for the states who left gaps. And I think that's the flip side of the coin of the incentives and the consequences for states. So that's Amy's reporting soapbox for the day. Any other questions in the room? I have a few more online, but I wanted to make sure I gave some space. Okay, so here's another one. This is a little, if you're in this conversation, you'll kind of know what direction this is coming from. So should the UI system require in-person applications to establish benefit rights before permitting weekly or continuing claims to be filed? So this is sort of a throwback. This is the way unemployment insurance used to always work effectively, as the ES office was the place that you went to file a claim. So what do you think about, basically the underlying question is, how do we sort of establish the veracity of a claim up front? So do we need to rethink that maybe post-pandemic?
I think fraud happens in person too.
Yeah.
So just having it in person isn't going to solve your fraudulent issues. I mean, I gave that example at the job center, right, where this person would just kind of show up and knew the sort of work. And, you can fake an ID and be like, show up and show your photo ID, right? And so, I mean, there's just regular good old-fashioned fraud that's going to happen, whether it's in person or online. And, so going back to that now, do I feel like there should be a better connection? Because again, unemployment is a reemployment program. Because we should, at the impetus when you're establishing the claim, get reemployment services in there ASAP, right? And if that's the case and someone is genuinely out of work and looking for work, and you see the pickup on that type of services more, or doing the required type of things like 3 work search activities, well, maybe we really need to take a look at what are really good measurable work search activities that we can validate in ways that essentially lead to the legitimacy or credibility of that claimant truly being out of work and looking for work, right? So I think there is something to be said about having in-person services, but is it the unemployment claim establishing part that needs to be where the human touch point is, or is it that, again, having that potential handoff to the workforce services side, making sure that that connection happens, that you're really helping to push the reemployment portion?
I think that there are, I think that one of the things that's missing in the conversation about verification of individuals, right? Having somebody show up in person certainly doesn't address the equity issues that creates that are very real, right? Oftentimes we are serving the hard to serve population, but there are things that can be done to more involve the actual owners of the identities in this process that nobody's really talking about. And so, we are working on some things that we can try to help states do more of that. But I think that there are other initiatives that would be as successful, are as successful, can be as successful without, creating those barriers for others.
Yeah. So I guess this may be because we're kind of coming to a conclusion here, but what's sort of a storyline or a perspective that maybe you think has gotten lost in the post-pandemic fraud conversation? So obviously there's been all of this energy, all of this operational exertion to sort of help American workers. The fraud conversation is full steam ahead. What's something that you maybe wish people knew or you think has sort of gotten lost in the noise in the past few years? Anyone can take it.
I think the immediacy of getting, benefits out and into households, the unemployment system did its job, right? We injected money into the economy so that the economy could keep going at some point. In Missouri, for instance, we had over $7 billion worth of benefits that went out, and that was huge to the economy. But it doesn't, it shouldn't come at the cost of potentially, foregoing that sort of integrity measures and credibility measures on the front end. And, again, it's that balancing act again of how do you deliver services but also protect the trust.
And what would you say to people who say those are two opposing goals?
I don't think they are in the sense that I think you really need to have good communication with all parties involved, right? The employers themselves, I think are very mindful of the fact that they are sending those payroll taxes forward and it's coming back to fund not just those benefits, but your administration of the program as well. And if you make a convincing conversation that, hey, look, the fraudsters are out there and they're active and they will continue to be active. Like, for instance, in Missouri, we were able to pass a law with the help of he was a representative at the time, Alan Andrews is our Division of Employment Security Director. He's here with me today. But it was really important for us to make sure employers knew that, with the administrative funding coming down from the federal level, that it was all based on volume. So when you have really low unemployment, which we're happy to have low unemployment in Missouri, means the economy is doing well, right? But that also means that the administrative dollars that we're getting back to invest in actually improving not just service delivery, but also those fraud prevention measures wasn't there. So we were able to pass 2 years ago a bill that allowed us to basically create a fund that is only going to be for IT maintenance of UI. And that's really important. That was an important statement by our employers and the legislators to say, like, hey, look, we understand the sort of challenges that happened during the pandemic. We want to protect the investments that we have, and it is about having those conversations more broadly.
Yeah.
So there's my wife and I. We have a daughter in high school, and she's doing it. She's a great student, but she's struggling in one of her classes. And so when her report card came home, we honed in on the bad grade. And while I'm not suggesting that we overlook and we absolutely should continue the dissection of what happened and how we can prevent it, there are a lot of very positive things that have come out of this that got lost in the shuffle, as the question was. So just last week, we were talking to one of our members, and over a recent period, they didn't pay 70% of claims that were filed because they were fraud. Right, another state didn't authorize 80% of their new employer registrations because they were fictitious employer registrations, and so it was sort of incredible for us to see the number of UI directors that were replaced and the number of state administrators that were replaced in the height of the pandemic because of everything that was going wrong. But at the same time, there was a lot going right, but of course overshadowed by what went down. So,
I mean, I would say that a lot of the news reports in the pandemic fraud, we heard a lot about people who got, like, say, PPP loans and bought Lamborghinis. This was like a big thing, right? Looking at like the rap stars or the movie stars that got these different, benefits, pandemic benefits, mostly the small business benefits. That got a lot of attention, but the majority of the fraud happened in the unemployment assistance program, and majority of it went through identity theft. And as the numbers bear it out in your report, you talk about the fact that today they recovered between 8 cents and $3 out of every $100 that was stolen. Identity theft fraud doesn't get recovered. So this concept of pay and chase that everybody likes to talk about, so we do in government, we pay and we go back and chase. You can't chase identity theft-based fraud. It's gone. And in many cases, it went to adversarial nations. And so, I think what gets lost is this idea that, we think that, just a few people, they stole the money and they bought expensive jewelry and cars, when really this is like massive stolen funds from adversarial nation-state actors. And identity theft is the way fraud is happening today. The pandemic highlighted that. It's going to continue to be the way it happens going forward. And it's not the same kind of fraud we experienced in the past. So the thing I think that really needs to be paid attention to is how we can truly combat and prevent identity theft-based fraud, because we can't do anything about it once we've lost the money.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic note to wrap up on. So thank you, everyone who's joined us online and here in the room. Just join me in giving our wonderful panel a round of applause. So.